The very first step in developing healthy language that will hopefully lead to a form of resolution or at least a mutual agreement on a situation is we have to first recognize our own worth and our own identity. You see, what happens in a narcissistic relationship, oftentimes we have seen people who have been emotionally kind of beaten. Can I say that? Where they have been, where they've been told it's your fault. And as I mentioned, we try to kind of keep that peace. And so your first step before you get to that stage of kind of confronting or doing that is to recognize your own worth, right? You talked about what do we say to those farms who are willing to walk away? You have to care for yourself. Remember that trauma that's not transformed is trauma transferred, and you have generations coming behind you that absolutely depend on your ability to kind of set some boundaries. Likewise, for those that stay on the farm that say, I've had the same thing. I've had those conversations with those that are like, you know what, I just have to put up with this. I have learned the skills that they need to thrive. And many of them have. They've learned the skills in order to thrive despite the challenges on the farm, and they're willing to continue learning. And so for those that are staying on the farm, I also would say learn to set some boundaries.
Welcome to the Farm Family Harmony podcast. I'm Elaine Froese, Farm Family Coach, here with another episode full of transition tips, tactics, and sometimes hard truths to get harmony on your farm. Hi there, folks. It's Elaine Froese. Glad you're here with us again for episode 44 of the Farm Family Harmony podcast. And I'm really excited today, and I'm pretty sure you've hooked into the title of this podcast because we're calling it Navigating Narcissism on the Farm. Now, I've been a farm family coach for over 30 years, and I can tell you that I never even heard the word narcissism probably until about 5 years ago. And now I hear it like once a month. But before we start, I brought my sheep with me because I have an affection for sheep. And I'm just going to tell you a little story before I introduce our guest, Lauren Van Ewyk. Lauren is a sheep farmer, which is why I brought my sheep talking stick today. But sheep are important to me because this sheep comes from the coast of California, Santa Barbara, actually, where I was doing my coaching work and schooling in 2003. There was a huge ocean storm, tons of waves. They hadn't had rain for 150 days. And so I'm walking after this huge storm, and this is what I found on the beach. And why this is special to me is because when I was a young teenager and hearing the story of Jesus being the good shepherd and the sheep know my voice, that's what convinced me that I needed to have a more intimate relationship with him. And so this to me is a bit of a miracle because you don't usually find stuffed sheep on the beach. So Lauren, this is the talking stick I brought for you today. So let's introduce you to our guest because Lauren is a co-founder of the National Farmers Mental Health Alliance. We've been encouraging each other for more than a couple of years now. And her goal and mission is to have more ag-informed therapists. So I'm a farm family coach, and I always say counseling is about recovery, coaching is about discovery. Lauren is a therapist and a social worker. So Lauren, tell us your story.
Wow, thank you. I'm so delighted to be on this podcast with you, Elaine. And you're right. I have been so encouraged by your work, and it has been a pleasure to partner with you in different facets of our work together in supporting farm families. A little bit about myself. You're right. I am a sheep farmer. We also have an on-farm store where we sell our products from the farm. I am a registered social worker. I have the privilege right now of being a PhD student at the University of Guelph in rural studies. And my husband and I are also foster parents. And so as a believer, I have the absolute pleasure of being a mom to children who weren't born to me. And I count that a huge privilege.
I just can hear the phones ringing now. I want to talk to Lauren about Notice. I want to talk to Lauren about direct farm marketing. I want to talk to Lauren about being a foster parent.
Oh my goodness.
That's a lot of roles and goals all at the same time. But today we want to focus on your expertise and how you counsel farm families. So we invited you back in the fall to talk to our membership group. And we had you on as a special speaker, which why I wanted you to be on the podcast. Because it was very enlightening, Lauren, to understand narcissism better. So first of all, let's define why are we hearing this word so much more in farm families? And what is a narcissist when it comes to farm family dynamics?
Yeah, it's a really important term because you're right. We didn't used to use it very often at all. And now sometimes it's kind of the pick of the day. And the danger with that is sometimes we attribute something that's very clinical to a specific experience that's not intended to be clinical. And the reason I say that is because we actually are all a little bit narcissistic, right? Like the narcissism is on this continuum, and certainly at one end, you have people who are really hard to work with in relationship. They focus on themselves. They are not likely to ever kind of accept or to recognize their own contribution to a situation that's not healthy. They're much more likely to kind of blame the other person. um, Inevitably in relationships, we see somebody who has had to kind of almost like be the mat for the person who has narcissism in an effort to keep peace. We see this go on. And it's very interesting to me because oftentimes as I work with Christians, they will think that that's what the word of God calls us to, is to be this kind of mat for this person who is really domineering. And so I hope we get a chance to talk about that today, because that's not actually the biblical approach. But so one of the reasons we're seeing it more often is, and I find this fascinating, I'm sure you do too, is we see narcissism increase during times of prosperity. And so now all that's, we would tend to think that, farming is really difficult. We're dealing with a lot of debt. That's absolutely true. And I don't mean to minimize that. But what happens is when we have started to focus on ourselves and our own needs, we then develop fear of losing what we have. And so that's one of the reasons why we've seen narcissism climb.
And I'm just thinking of a case, a client family where it became identified in a joint venture. I won't say too much more other than the fact that the younger generation was beside themselves because nothing they did was ever good enough, and they had to make adjustments and leave and go and start a relationship and an operation somewhere else. So
Mm,
you don't wanna put people well, I think the other thing from what you just said is I'm not a psychologist or a social worker or a therapist, so I'm not gonna diagnose situations, which is not healthy. But I think with families that listen to this podcast, and I wanna give a shout out to, the young man who just emailed me last night and said, "Elaine, I listened to your podcast. I like your approach. Let's talk." And so really want to encourage families to share this podcast with other family members, not with the intention of "I told you so" kind of behavior or language, but you and I are both here as servants, and we are here to serve the farming community, and we are here to give practical tools. So I think, Lauren, when you talk about dealing with someone who is afraid that their needs aren't going to get met and it's always about them, the other people are yes dear, whatever you say, and that's not healthy either.
mm,
What's some good language to help people understand? Because when you did your session with our membership site in the fall, you used this term about dropping a stone and using curiosity. So give us some even phrases that help pull things back to center to make it more workable. Because we have called this podcast Navigating Narcissism. Because what I've read, there's a book actually called Emotional Vampires, which a person, I don't know if you read that one, but I'm pretty sure there's probably 10 books on narcissism that you can read more. And people now, of course, read articles on the internet. So, what is helpful language for dealing with feeling attacked and feeling like,
mhm, mhm.
"Man, this is not healthy"?
The very first step in developing healthy language that will hopefully lead to a form of resolution or at least a mutual agreement on a situation is we have to first recognize our own worth and our own identity. You see, what happens in a narcissistic relationship, oftentimes we have seen people who have been emotionally kind of beaten. Can I say that? Where they have been, where they've been
Traumatized.
told it's your fault. And as I mentioned, we try to kind of keep that peace. And so your first step before you get to that stage of kind of confronting or doing that is to recognize your own worth. And I often tell the story of this young 18-year-old gal who came into my office, and for time I'm going to shorten it a little bit, but basically she had everything going for her. You would look at her and think she has every reason in the world to live. And yet in my office, she was crying and saying, I don't think, my life is worth living. And so I said to her, has anyone ever told you that you're precious? Like, has anyone ever told you that you have inherent value? Like an authority on that value. And through those tears, she said, no one has ever told me. So if that's you listening today, let Elaine and I be the first to say, you have incredible value.
Yeah.
You play an invaluable role in our world and our community, and it's not by accident. And so that's the first piece. Come to an understanding of your identity is not in this situation. One of the second pieces, and you alluded or you chatted about, was that piece about curiosity. And curiosity is, in my opinion, almost like I don't want to say like a magic stick, but it's just like
Well,
it's
the door opener. So we.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a brilliant way of saying it. Using curiosity, in fact, I've worked with some people who have others in their lives that are very challenging in relationship. And if they can use curiosity enough, they actually end up helping that other person figure out their own problems. So, for instance, if I had somebody who was coming to me asking me advice all the time, that gets draining. And if they're looking to me to solve their problems, that gets draining. But if I can use curiosity effectively, it puts that responsibility back on that person to really think through what they're saying and think through the issues. It's a way of actually setting a boundary without having to be really firm and push back, right? It's a way of setting a boundary without having to draw that line in the sand, so to speak. And so curiosity is a real valuable tool. People will say, "Well, what does that look like?" Well, there's your answer. What does that look like? If somebody were to come to me and be like, well, you're not helping out enough on the farm and I'm having to do more work and, you've really hurt me. And you can use curiosity and say, okay, well, help me understand what you really expect from me, right? Help me understand how I've hurt you. Help me understand what your responsibility is in the relationship. Right. And so you're using these open ended questions. So you invite communication. But if you notice in that last question, yeah, you want to get curious to understand their perspective, but then you can use curiosity to kind of drive home your own story.
It's
Help me.
yeah, help me
Sorry, go
understand.
ahead.
Well, I also like the phrase, "I'm just curious. Can you
Mm.
explain to me why you keep rolling up your black socks in a ball and throwing them down the hallway?" Which is a true story from my marriage of 43. And my husband knows I tell this story, and people in the audience go, "Really?" I go, "Yeah," because again, it's a habit, right? And yes, we are in farm relationships where there are habits that as coaches we call pinch points. But when you start feeling like the narcissist or the person, it's always about them. The other thing that I was interested in what you said to our group, Lauren, is I didn't realize before that there's also some trauma, like with this 18-year-old girl who was in your office. From the
Mhm.
outside, it looked like her world was perfect, right? And that's where the Irish saying comes, every front door looks beautiful.
Mm.
Came through your front door to your office,
Mhm.
you discovered internally things were not beautiful because she had no sense of worth or sense of value, a sense of identity. And I just want to give a shout out to Susie Larson, who's my podcast favorite with Susie Larson Live. And she interviews a fellow named Janie Winship, who says it's all about identity. And when we
Mhm.
know where true identity is. And so as a farm partner, whatever spouse you are or partner, you do have value, and so if you are navigating a situation where you're always being felt like you're the victim and nothing you do is ever good enough, then you need to go and get some help for better language and understanding how you can get stronger. And that's why I wanted you on today, is because I think people are just, they can read all kinds of books, they can do all kinds of searches on the articles on the internet, but farmers are very practical people. They want practical help.
They do. It's so interesting to me. I remember reading a study where they said that farmers aren't as resilient as the general population. And I think I almost ripped the study in half because I thought we are so resilient. The problem happens when A, you're not measuring our resilience properly, and the other piece is is we are fixers by nature, but we need to be given the proper tools in order to fix those situations. And the tools we use sometimes on relationships on the farm look different than the other relationships in our lives. So absolutely, when you talk about that piece of identity, we have to understand that as farmers, sometimes we have tattooed across our forehead, we're a farmer and that's all we are, but that's not all we are. We're a spouse, we're a parent, we are a community member, we might be a church contributor, right? Like there's all different pieces of this identity, and we want to grow our sense of identity, not to minimize who we are as farmers, but to understand that we are complex people in a complex world, and we bring more to the table than what we realize, I think.
But farmers also, from the neuro-linguistic programming field, my friend Shelley Rose Charvet wrote a book, Words That Change Minds, and she said people are either away from in their behavior or they go toward. And as you said, farmers want to fix problems, and so they want to move away from things. So how do you navigate, Lauren? What does a listener do today when they say, "Oh my goodness, they're talking about what I'm feeling and sensing and thinking is happening, and I just can't take this dynamic anymore." What's a good next step or first step for that person to take?
Well, I think as you mentioned, you actually mentioned trauma. You kind of dropped that in that stone as we talked about on that previous episode together. And we should probably explain that because dropping a stone is like, I think this is what's going on. Let me drop the stone and walk away. We don't have to stay there and confront people. I think far too often, some of us in our relationships, we're looking for resolution right now and we want to talk about it, talk about it, talk about it. And it ends up, yeah, it ends up pushing the other person to a place where they're not ready.
No, and I
Yeah,
think it also fuels defensiveness.
it does.
Yeah.
It sure does. Yeah. So sometimes, when you're looking to kind of grow that area or solve those things, it's okay for you to kind of say, I think this might be what's happening. Let me just leave that with you. The other piece you mentioned was trauma, and part of recognizing our own worth and our own identity is also recognizing the impact of generational trauma, and I don't think this is well understood, in our world, even though it's spoken about in the Bible. It talks about,
And the
curses
sins
and
of
it.
the fathers that go to the next generation and the next.
Right. Absolutely. And so we have to understand that trauma is actually carried on the DNA for 5 to 6 generations if no further trauma occurs. Now, I want to be really clear. That doesn't mean that if your parents experience trauma, then your kids are going to feel the effect no matter what. No, no. We have, by God's grace, we're able to change how those receptors are kind of expressed. Those proprioceptor cells are expressed. That just means, though, that we sometimes have to do the hard work. You see, trauma that's not transformed is trauma transferred. And what I see most often in individuals who are working with somebody who experiences narcissism, there's a root of trauma in their life.
So something has happened.
Yeah, and sometimes one of the pieces that we know is that piece about identity. There's this thing called unhelpful guilt. Unhelpful guilt means we're kind of looking to please people all the time. It actually starts as early as 3 to 5 years of age, where we're looking to please an adult. And in an adult, when that hasn't been satisfied as a child, we continue to seek to please other people around us.
At our
In an At our own expense to a degree that's unhealthy. And so, we end up being in that place where as we talked about, we become mass, or we end up being in that place where we become narcissistic and seek to control other people to satisfy our sense of value and worth. And so ultimately, it really all does come back and come down to us accepting the fact that we are fiercely loved and that we are incredibly precious. When we don't understand that truth, from there comes hurt, and from there comes pain, and from there we end up, kind of casting that onto other people as well.
So I met a woman last week when I was on holiday who had a name tag, and her name is Precious.
Oh,
And I
cool.
said to her, "You're the second person I've ever met whose name is Precious." And I have a lovely story about my mom who, kissed me goodnight, even till I was 22 years, Lauren, and she always kissed me goodnight and said, "Good night, precious." And so I grew up knowing deep
Mm.
doubt that I was deeply loved. And I think that's part of what we want to share with people as a sense of hope that things can change once you really get right deep down to your DNA and your cells that you are deeply loved and you are precious and that you have a valued identity. There's also a book that I've mentioned in another podcast that I did with Patricia Morgan that I'd also like people to go back to, where she mentions the book, The Body Keeps Score. So, the trauma that people carry around is literally also physical too, right?
Mhm.
I would
Yeah.
I'd like you to unpack that a bit more in terms of another thing that you mentioned was you mentioned resilience, that farmers are resilient, but how does narcissism show itself, or what's the attachment between narcissism and being a workaholic? Because is that part of people pleasing, or are workaholics just lazy in relationship?
Wow, what a great question. Typically, actually, workaholics are not lazy in relationship, but
Okay.
workaholics have found their meaning and their value in
This is
working in the work they do.
this
What
is
we know, sorry, what's that?
this is what I accomplished. I did it myself. I fixed it myself, and now it's done the right way.
That's right. That's right. And so they find their meaning, they find their identity in that piece. You see, yeah, a lot of it does stem back from some of those earlier experiences. Although it's important for us to recognize we can't just blame everything in the past. We still have to take responsibility for who we are and the situations before us now. So it's important that we understand that. But what we see from farmers is this piece about resilience. Farmers are now or have been for some time in what I call kind of the chronic resilience, or we've even used the term the dark side of resilience. And the dark side of resilience, so that chronic resilience means we've had to be resilient for so long, time and time and time again. And for farmers, chronic stress actually has the same effect on the brain that we would see when somebody experiences trauma. We get hypervigilant, right? We are already jumping ahead. Our brain is always working, right? All of those pieces are part of that. And so for farmers, simply because you've been under chronic stress for a long period of time, that leads to what I would call resilience fatigue. And that resilience fatigue, actually, the way that I've kind of drawn it out, has four different stages. And the last stage is this zombie stage where we kind of give up. We just go headlong and we do it ourselves because nobody else would do as good a job as we would do anyway. We can't really depend on anybody else. We just have to depend on ourselves. But we've also come to a place where we experience hopelessness and helplessness when we're in that stage. And so when we're in that stage, it absolutely contributes to feelings of that narcissism or experiences of narcissism because it comes across like we're just focused on ourselves and what we want. But we've gotten to that place because we've had to be resilient for so long. We've gotten to that place because we're quite frankly exhausted
Awesome.
and have experienced burnout. And so that's where I actually have, I mean, narcissism, I got to be honest with you, really, really hard in relationship, really hard. But I do want to encourage some compassion because the reason people have gotten there is because of trauma. It's because of chronic stress. It's because of this feeling like no matter what they do, they just never quite meet that mark.
Yeah, and I also wonder, there's a lovely book that's no longer in print. It's called The Gift of the Blessing by John Smalley and Trent. And
Mm,
it's actually the biblical principle too of not getting the father's blessing. And you
mm,
say, and I see that in relationships of typically successor sons, sometimes daughters, but striving and striving to please the father. And it's no matter what we do on this farm, Elaine, it's never, and
never good enough.
and why do you know that answer, Lauren?
Yeah, because
I've said it in front of 200 farmers at the exact same time, and they all say the exact same thing in unison. And so the question then becomes, how do people get healthy? How do people navigate this? And I know some families that feel they made the choice, Elaine, we can no longer try and navigate this. So we are going to leave and go and start again and do something different. But you have other people listening to this that say, Elaine, I'm not leaving. I'm going to learn how to navigate this. And how do people get healthy, Lauren, to, if nothing changes from the person who is fatigued and chronically stressed out and not
Mhm.
able to create a healthy dynamic on the farm that's workable to help the culture of that farm. What do you have to say to the people who say, no matter what happens, Elaine, I'm staying?
Well, you do have to kind of two different camps there, although there's a lot of overlap. But the one thing I'm hearing you say is it doesn't matter which camp you're in, caring for yourself is really important.
Paramount. Yeah.
Right? You absolutely have to care for your and you're right, we do know that, and part of that, I think, stems from that generational a big piece of it stems from generational trauma. When we've had to be resilient for so long, we lose out on the aspect of vulnerability in relationship. And when we don't have vulnerability in relationship, we don't have trust. We don't have authenticity. And so we've got children who are like, I need this. I need this authenticity. And my parents are unable to provide that. And so if you're kind of among the more senior groups here, I would really encourage you to be open to learning about how trauma has impacted you and how it might be impacting your generations to come after. So that's one aspect of it.
And also, trust is a good function of a highly functioning team. So another book, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lenciani, says that, when trust goes down, then the team is not
It's not functioning well.
functioning well. And the
Yep.
second things he talks about is conflict avoidance. And so that's my other encouragement to the listeners is conflict is a good thing as long as you start learning about how to do it better. So when you talk about dropping the stone, the conflict piece in that is being able to reach out, drop the stone and say, I see you doing this over and over again. I just want you to be aware or help me to understand. But we're not going to talk about this right now. But this is what just happened. And this
Mhm.
stop happening over and over again. I'll just let you think about it right now. I'm just going to drop the stone. And I don't people say
That's right.
that. I never do anything
So,
before.
so
We're just gonna
right. I
drop
mean,
the elevator
that's right. Just drop.
and let you think about it and let you process it. But I think the other thing, you are one of the co-founders of the National Farmers Mental Health Alliance, and our team has been in your beta program to see all the amazing learning that you doing in training therapists to understand the culture of agriculture and how that is so different in counseling and therapy for a farmer. So I have noticed in the last 3 to 4 years, many young farmers, particularly, and some older ones, saying, Elaine, I am going for therapy. And I say, awesome. That's wonderful. And self-declaring that that is the choice that they've made to get rid of those trauma responses and to show up in a healthy
Yes.
way on their farms.
We have to come to the place where we're willing to identify those pieces, right? You talked about what do we say to those farms who are willing to walk away? You have to care for yourself. Remember that trauma that's not transformed is trauma transferred, and you have generations coming behind you that absolutely depend on your ability to kind of set some boundaries. Likewise, for those that stay on the farm that say, I've had the same thing. I've had those conversations with those that are like, you know what? I just have to put up with this. I have learned the skills that they need to thrive. And many of them have. They've learned the skills in order to thrive despite the challenges on the farm, and they're willing to continue learning. And so for those that are staying on the farm, I also would say learn to set some boundaries, because we have to do that in order to protect ourselves and care for ourselves. But the other thing we do when we set boundaries is we force the person on the other side of that boundary to take a look at themselves. We force them to take a bit of an inventory. We force them to sometimes get the support they need. And maybe they go to get some counseling, or they reach out to a life coach and kind of figure out where they want to head and what they want to do to change from here on out. So there's a very different outcome based in those two situations. And yet the foundations of both are the same. Caring for yourself is important. Spend time with the Lord, spend time with people who encourage you, that speak life into you, and set those boundaries.
Yeah, and another thing I've heard too in the trend in the dialogue recently is people my age in their 60s or 70s are not happy with some of the boundaries, Lauren, that are being set by the next and younger generation. And I had an experience recently coaching where we had this amazing breakthrough in the Zoom meeting, in the family meeting, where someone finally understood that their first response to any kind of ask or curiosity was defensiveness. It's
Mm.
actually a course on defensiveness that Lydia Carpenter, one of my coaches, has taken, and it's by Mediation Skills, and we'll put that in the show notes as well. But the mom in this case had taken the course, and she is the driver, like many moms are, of the transition process. But it was a beautiful moment to watch where someone finally had self-awareness and vulnerability, as you mentioned, to say,
Mhm.
that really helps me because I had no idea that I was pushing back. And so, and you know, if you are some people will call it drama, and I've also heard the saying, just because there's drama on your farm doesn't mean you have to attend the performance, which
I love that.
I know. But there's a lot of intensity, right? Because there's a lot of moving parts and complexity. So all of this to say, it was beautiful to watch the person and persons understand that their knee-jerk reaction and loud voice and sort of tonality that wasn't helpful was really intimidating to the personality who wanted to work things out in a soothing, more calm way. And so I think another prop that I don't have close to me is a mirror. Is what do you have? And I think, what do you control in terms of your internal and external well-being? And you said, fill your bucket or be with friends who fill you up and spend time with God or have quiet time. And I'm also concerned, quite frankly, about cell phone behavior and screen time for farmers and their brains, because I think a lot of farmers are addicted to the dopamine hit on their phones, and their brains, like you say, have been under chronic stress for a very long time. So, the best resources, how do people find you?
Well, thank you. I mean, if you Google us, you'll find us, but we're at the National Farmers Mental Health Alliance. So that's nfmha.ca. And there, if you're looking for a therapist, there's a kind of a directory there that you can find a therapist in your region. You can always call our 1-800 number. We'll be happy to hook you up with someone who just understand that every one of our therapists have taken agriculture informed training and they have lived agriculture experience. So, um, just as you have said, Elaine, sometimes we have complex histories and we have complex family pieces,
Thanks.
and so as a therapist, part of our job is to help you navigate that, help you understand and see it from perspectives, and to understand how it's impacted you in your development. I also have a podcast called The Rural Well, along with Bridget Riddell, who you
Yes.
introduced us to, Elaine.
Yes.
So feel free to check us out on The Rural Well. You can find us on all social media, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and just check out the National Farmers Mental Health Alliance.
And the other encouragement I would have too is we've mentioned several books. Dr. Henry Cloud also wrote a book on boundaries and has a workbook. So we'll put those in the show notes as well for folks to look at. And I just want to thank you, Lauren, for just shining the light on. You've done a lot of work with farmers, and it really encourages my heart as a coach to know that farmers are calling you. And again, I know people in my province who work with you, and just because you live in Ontario and we live in Manitoba, we're doing what we're doing right now. There, that's the power of Zoom, right? And so for people who are feeling isolated and, oh, I live too far away from someone, we have, telephones, we have Zoom, we have other ways to make that connection to help people navigate a new chapter for them that's a lot healthier.
Yes, we have therapists who are certified in every different province, so they're licensed in different provinces. So depending on where you live, that will kind of dictate who you're able to see.
But you also have some American ones as well, correct?
We do. We have therapists in the States. So I think we have about 20 different states covered through therapists in the US that we've connected and that have taken our training.
Yeah, that's just really, really good. Well, thank you so much for
My
your
pleasure.
all the best with your PhD. I don't know where you study between 10 o'clock at night and midnight. You must be a night owl or something to do that. But really a pleasure to have you, Lauren, and really hope that our listeners will share this far and wide. Another thing that I caught just from what you said at the end was vulnerability is not a bad thing. It's a good way to start cracking open the jar of healing. And We say that about transition too, and I'm just going to hop onto that. Financial transparency is also really important for families to navigate fairness in their transition. So, a lot of the things that you mentioned today have been very practical help. So, I want to thank you for that. And, folks, I want you to start practicing. I'm just curious. I want you to start practicing. Help me understand. And I also want you to ask, what do you need today that you're not getting? And do you know that you are precious? Maybe that's a new word that we could hear more as a buzzword in agriculture. And for those of you, my ag women friends who make wonderful agricultural t-shirts, there's a new t-shirt for you. I am precious. Just want to add a piece to the podcast. I work with a therapist who's in Ontario, but she's not licensed to work in Manitoba. So her work with me is not therapy. And just to be clear, that the therapist that you work with will be licensed in the province or the state that you work in. And so we'll just add that to the show notes as well. Thanks for your listening. Bye.